That created about 3,500 polling stations in that category. What the Election Complaints Commission is doing a sample of those 3,500, looking at them. I think it'll be about 350 of these polling stations. They'll do an audit. That means they'll open the ballot box, look, for example, to see if the ballots were all marked the same way, look to see if there were any ballots in the ballot box to begin with, were the ballot papers folded, because if they weren't folded, that means they weren't put into the ballot box by a voter, because you could only get them in through the slot by voting. Anyhow, there are a number of audit techniques that they have. If, as it turns out, that random sample shows that almost all of it's fraudulent, they will then exclude the full 3,000, and then we'll see whether that leads to a runoff. I have confidence in this process, which incidentally was only started after the disagreement between the head of the mission and myself became public. But there's a problem with it, which is not in any way the fault of the Election Complaints Commission. And the problem is that the fraud was committed on a massive scale. Up to a third of the votes for President Karzai were not actually cast by voters. This process will catch some of the fraud, hopefully a lot of the fraud, but a lot of the fraud will remain undetected. And so that's what is going to make it so hard for Afghans, and particularly those who support the opposition, to have confidence in the final outcome.
Ambassador Peter Galbraith, have you been pressured by the United Nations not to speak to the press? And then I want to ask you about the latest attack over the weekend. 8 U.S. troops, 2 Afghan police officers died. Do you support a military surge in Afghanistan?
Well, to answer your first question, I want to emphasize that this disagreement between myself and the head of mission, it was longstanding, it was serious, and it was private. I did not choose to speak out. I did not speak out as long as I was working for the United Nations. Unfortunately, somebody else, a third party, leaked the news of this dispute in mid-September, and it became a worldwide story. Unfortunately, for my employment prospects, almost all the coverage was favorable to me and highly critical of my boss. At the time that I was being recalled, the Secretary General sent word to me that I should not talk to the press. I agreed, provided that the United Nations gave an accurate description of what was at issue, which nobody disputed, namely that this was a result of a disagreement over how to handle electoral fraud. Even that wasn't quite right, because it was really a disagreement about whether the United Nations should handle electoral fraud, but I went along with the how to handle electoral fraud. That was language proposed, incidentally, by the United Nations, not by me. That was all agreed. And then when my recall was announced, that wasn't the language that was used, and immediately UN press officials began to background the story that this was a personality clash. Well, that's not true. Eide and I have been friends since 1994. We worked together in the Balkans. He actually introduced me to my wife, who is Norwegian, which is why I'm speaking to you from Bergen, Norway. And this was a serious policy disagreement, and this effort to minimize it was a great disservice to the staff of the United Nations, who work so hard on the election issues, all of whom there's no disagreement within the UN mission. Everybody disagrees with the head of the mission. It was a disservice to them, and frankly, it was a disservice to the Afghan people to cover up, in a final effort to cover up the issues here. Now, to turn to your question on whether there should be an additional surge of U.S. troops, I'm against that at this time, for the simple reason that for the counterinsurgency strategy that is being proposed to President Obama, for that to work, you need to have an Afghan partner, a government, which is capable of establishing a reasonably efficient and honest administration in the areas that the U.S. troops then have cleared. And we don't have an Afghan government that's a credible partner. Given this election mess, a large part of the country is not going to accept Karzai if he, in fact, emerges from this as the legitimate leader. And so under those circumstances, the counterinsurgency strategy can't work, and therefore, in my view, it really makes no sense to put in additional troops.
Well, Ambassador Peter Galbraith, we want to thank you very much for joining us from Bergen, Norway. He was the top American diplomat at the UN, number 2 man at the UN in Afghanistan, just fired by the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. His books include The End of Iraq, How American Incompetence Created a War Without End, and also the book Unintended Consequences, How War in Iraq Strengthened America's Enemies. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org.